80 million years ago, the heart of North America was underwater. A warm, shallow sea stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Ocean, 2,000 miles long, running straight through the middle of the continent. It covered Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Alberta, Saskatchewan. The Rocky Mountains hadn't fully risen yet. There were no Great Plains. There was just open water, warm and bright and enormous, splitting the continent clean in two, and it was not peaceful. In a shallow sea, there is no depth to escape into, no dark water to disappear in. Everything hunted, everything was hunted, and the things that lived here were built for it. A paleontologist once cracked open a block of chalk in western Kansas and found a 20-foot fish with a 6-foot fish still locked inside its ribcage, both of them dead, both of them preserved for 80 million years, frozen at the exact moment the predator was killed by its own meal. That chalk had been sitting under a wheat field. It was seafloor. The apex predator of these waters was not a shark. It was not a fish. It was a lizard, 45 feet long, fast enough to run down anything that moved. It ate sharks the way sharks eat everything else, and when it died, it sank to a bottom that is now somewhere in Nebraska. And there is something that almost no one knows about this sea, something that reaches far beyond the water itself. This sea split the North American continent in two for 30 million years. That split determined which animals could move, which populations were cut off, which evolutionary paths ran, and which ones ended. Tyrannosaurus rex exists because of this sea. Without it, the chain that produced the most famous predator in natural history would never have run. The sea is gone now, but it left everything behind. Shark teeth still wash out of Kansas farmland after heavy rain. In the Badlands of Alberta, the rock faces you walk past were once the muddy floor of this sea. The bones are still down there, under the wheat, under the highways, under the prairie, exactly where they sank. Tonight, we're returning to that vanished ocean to uncover what lived inside it, how it divided a continent, and why almost everything that ruled its waters eventually disappeared. But before we begin, I'm curious, is this your first time here, or have you been down this rabbit hole with us before? Let me know in the comments. Now, let's head beneath the surface. Long before the first waves spread across the heart of North America, the shape of the continent had already begun to change beneath its own weight. The transformation did not begin with water. It began deep below the surface, where immense slabs of Earth's outer shell moved at the pace of growing forests, carrying enough force to reshape an entire continent over millions of years. Around 100 million years ago, the planet itself looked unfamiliar. There were no permanent polar ice caps locking away vast stores of water, and the global climate remained much warmer than today. Oceans stood far higher along the edges of the continents, flooding coastlines that would now seem impossibly distant from the sea. Across what would someday become the American Midwest, the land rested low enough that only a gradual change in elevation separated broad plains from advancing shorelines. Far beyond the western horizon, beneath the ancient Pacific Ocean, an oceanic plate known as the Farallon Plate continued its slow descent beneath the western edge of North America. This process, called subduction, unfolded over spans of time so immense that no living creature could ever witness its full course. As the dense oceanic crust slipped downward, the overriding continent responded. Instead of remaining rigid, the interior bent gently, creating a broad depression that stretched across the center of the continent. That shallow basin became an invitation for the oceans themselves. From the north, waters belonging to the Arctic Ocean gradually pressed southward. From the opposite direction, the Gulf of Mexico expanded inland as global sea levels remained elevated. Neither advance happened in a dramatic rush. Coastlines wandered across the landscape a little farther with each passing age, leaving behind new shorelines, shallow bays, and broad coastal marshes before advancing again. Eventually, those separate marine waters met near the center of North America. What had once been an uninterrupted continent became divided by an immense inland sea reaching roughly 2,000 miles from north to south and nearly 600 miles across at its greatest width. Travelers standing on one shoreline would have found only open water extending beyond the horizon, giving little hint that another coast existed far away across the broad expanse. Its earliest recognizable stage is known as the Maury Sea, an arm of the Arctic reaching steadily into the continent before connecting with waters arriving from the south. Once those marine pathways joined together, the great inland waterway achieved its full identity. Today, it carries several names in the scientific record, including the Western Interior Seaway, the Cretaceous Seaway, the Niobraran Sea, and the North American Inland Sea. Each title reflects a different tradition of study, yet all describe the same remarkable body of water that transformed the geography of an entire continent. For approximately 34 million years, this inland sea never remained entirely fixed. It expanded across the plains during intervals of rising water, then withdrew as shorelines shifted once more. These repeated advances and retreats unfolded gradually, following changes in sea level, tectonic movement, and the evolving landscape beneath them. By around 66 million years ago, the final waters had retreated, leaving behind an exposed seafloor that would slowly harden into the rocks and chalk preserved beneath the Great Plains. Although immense in length and breadth, the seaway was modest in depth compared with the great oceans of the world. Its deepest regions reached about 2,500 feet, while vast stretches remained much shallower. That broad, sunlit water column allowed light, warmth, nutrients, and life to spread across an extraordinary area. The same geological forces that opened this inland passage had created not merely another sea, but a distinctive marine world whose character was shaped as much by its limited depth as by its astonishing size. Size alone does not determine how dangerous an ocean can become. A vast body of water may stretch beyond every horizon, yet still offer countless paths of escape through its immense depth. The Western Interior Seaway followed a different design. Its greatest strength as an ecosystem also became the reason life within it existed under nearly constant pressure, because almost everything that happened unfolded inside a remarkably compressed world. Even at its deepest, this inland sea reached only about 2,500 feet. Across broad portions of its central basin, the water measured far less, often between roughly 300 and 900 feet from surface to seafloor, compared with the Pacific Ocean, whose average depth exceeds 14,000 feet. The difference was extraordinary. One was an immense layered ocean with room for countless vertical habitats. The other spread across a continent like an enormous sunlit shelf. That distinction reshaped every encounter beneath the surface. In truly deep seas, animals pursued by predators can descend into colder water, drift beneath changing layers of temperature, or vanish into regions where little light penetrates. Depth itself becomes another direction of travel, opening routes that reduce direct competition. Within the Western Interior Seaway, those opportunities were far more limited. Most of the living world occupied the same relatively narrow column of water, sharing space generation after generation. The geography of the seaway also favored swift pursuit. Long stretches of open water contained few physical barriers to interrupt a chase. Predators evolved bodies built for sustained horizontal movement, slicing through warm currents with powerful tails and streamlined forms. Their prey relied on speed, sharp turns, schooling behavior, or sudden bursts of acceleration, yet every escape unfolded within boundaries that remained surprisingly close above and below. Warm water added another layer to this crowded environment. Surface temperatures ranged from about 71 degrees Fahrenheit to well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit in some regions, providing conditions that supported rapid biological activity across much of the seaway. Animals living in these waters consumed energy quickly, grew rapidly, and required frequent meals to sustain active lives. Hunting, therefore, became not an occasional event, but an ordinary rhythm repeated across every level of the ecosystem. Abundant nutrients continually entered the sea from surrounding rivers and coastal environments. Sunlit waters encouraged blooms of microscopic life that formed the foundation of an immense food web. Tiny drifting organisms nourished larger plankton, which in turn supported schools of fish, shelled invertebrates, and countless ammonites spiraling through the water. Those populations attracted increasingly larger hunters, creating an almost continuous chain of pursuit, stretching from the smallest organisms to the greatest reptiles. Because food remained plentiful, many large predators occupied the same marine landscape instead of separating into distant territories. Different species specialized in different prey, swimming styles, or hunting depths, yet their ranges frequently overlapped. Encounters between formidable hunters became inevitable. Rather than one dominant carnivore ruling an empty sea, several powerful lineages shared the same broad hunting grounds, each competing for resources that never remained secure for long. The result was an ecosystem of remarkable density. Fossils recovered from these ancient rocks reveal repeated evidence of animals feeding upon one another across nearly every size class. Large fish swallowed smaller fish, sharks pursued those larger fish, marine reptiles hunted both. Even the greatest predators sometimes bore injuries from rivals of their own kind, suggesting that competition extended beyond the search for prey into direct conflict between equally formidable animals. Within only a few hundred feet of water, entire dramas of pursuit, survival, and loss unfolded every day. A powerful fish might become the meal of a swift shark. That shark could itself fall beneath the jaws of a massive mosasaur. Another mosasaur, larger still, might strike its own relative with tremendous force in a contest over territory or opportunity. The sea offered extraordinary abundance, yet its limited depth gathered nearly every participant into the same living arena where distance alone rarely provided refuge. Light shaped this sea from above long before darkness shaped it from below. Near the surface, sunlight reached deep into remarkably clear water, feeding immense blooms of microscopic life that drifted wherever gentle currents carried them. The upper layers remained warm throughout much of the year, with temperatures comparable to the modern Gulf of Mexico, generally ranging from about 71 degrees Fahrenheit to well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the warmest regions. It was an inviting environment for life, one where energy flowed almost continuously from sunlight into an intricate web of living organisms. Those microscopic communities formed the foundation of everything that followed. Tiny algae multiplied in astonishing numbers, capturing sunlight and transforming it into living tissue. Small drifting animals grazed upon them, fish consumed the drifting animals, and larger hunters pursued the fish in an endless sequence of feeding that filled the water column from top to bottom. Every successful hunt, every drifting shell, and every fragment of organic material eventually began the same slow descent toward the seafloor. That constant downward journey created what paleontologists often describe as a continuous rain of organic matter. Dead plankton, broken shells, fragments of plants carried from distant shores, animal waste, and the remains of countless creatures settled through the water day after day. Each particle seemed insignificant on its own, yet together they supplied an enormous amount of material to the world below, where armies of bacteria immediately began breaking it apart. The work of those microorganisms required oxygen. As decomposition continued, dissolved oxygen within the deepest water was steadily consumed. Fresh supplies from the surface could not always replace what had been used, particularly across the broad, gently circulating floor of the seaway. During these intervals, the deepest layers entered a condition known as anoxia, meaning the water contained so little oxygen that most animals could no longer survive there. The seafloor became a place almost entirely abandoned by creatures that normally burrowed, scavenged, or searched for food across marine sediments. What proved disastrous for ordinary bottom-dwelling life became one of paleontology's greatest fortunes. When a large fish, shark, turtle, or marine reptile finally drifted downward after death, remarkably few scavengers waited to dismantle it. Bacterial activity also slowed because of the limited oxygen supply. Instead of being scattered across the sea floor, many skeletons remained largely intact as delicate sediments gradually accumulated above them. Bones stayed connected. Entire bodies preserved the arrangement they held during life, creating an extraordinary record that survived through immense spans of geological time. On rare occasions, preservation reached an even more remarkable level. Certain fossil sharks retained outlines of their cartilaginous skeletons, structures that almost always disappear before fossilization can occur. Some mosasaurs preserved impressions of their skin, revealing the pattern of scales that once covered powerful bodies. Fossil fish have been uncovered with complete stomach contents still enclosed within their rib cages, preserving the final meal they consumed before death. These discoveries are not simply beautiful specimens. They provide direct evidence of anatomy, behavior, and ecology that would otherwise have vanished forever. Much of this remarkable preservation depended upon the character of the sediment itself. The floor of the seaway accumulated vast quantities of microscopic calcium carbonate plates produced by single-celled algae known as coccolithophores. When these organisms died, their tiny mineral coverings drifted downward in immense numbers, forming an exceptionally fine blanket across the basin. Over millions of years, those deposits compressed into the pale rock now called the Niobrara chalk. Because the grains were so delicate, newly arrived skeletons settled gently into them rather than being battered by coarse sand or gravel. Across millions of years, that chalk became far more than a layer of stone. It became an enduring record of an ancient marine world, preserving moments that normally disappear within days beneath modern oceans. Each carefully preserved skeleton, each trace of skin, each undisturbed stomach, filled with its final meal, reflects waters that sustained extraordinary abundance above, while allowing the deepest reaches of the basin to safeguard those lives for the distant future. Not every ruler of this ancient sea belonged to the lineage of reptiles or sharks. Among the swift hunters that patrolled the brightest waters was an immense bony fish named Xiphactinus, pronounced Xiphactinus. It occupied a place near the summit of the food web, demonstrating that bone alone could produce a predator every bit as formidable as cartilage or scales. Fully grown individuals reached lengths of about 20 feet, making Xiphactinus the largest known predatory bony fish of the Cretaceous world. Its body resembled a living spear, long, streamlined, and built to waste very little energy while moving through open water. Large, forward-facing eyes helped detect movement ahead, while a deeply forked tail generated tremendous bursts of acceleration. Every feature pointed toward speed. Rather than weaving through reefs or creeping along the bottom, this hunter belonged to the open surface waters where vision, timing, and momentum determined success. Its head gave the animal an unmistakable appearance. The lower jaw projected slightly beyond the upper, producing a profile that has often been compared to the face of a bulldog. Lining both jaws were long, slender teeth, shaped less for crushing than for gripping. Once prey slipped between those needle-like points, escape became exceedingly difficult. Instead of tearing victims into smaller pieces, Xiphactinus usually swallowed them whole, relying on a wide mouth and expandable throat to consume surprisingly large meals in a single attempt. Many paleontologists also suspect that this fish possessed a degree of endothermy, allowing parts of its body to remain warmer than the surrounding water. Such an adaptation would have provided an important advantage during sustained pursuits, keeping muscles responsive and reducing the limitations experienced by fully cold-blooded fish. Modern examples among certain fast-swimming fishes and sharks demonstrate how retaining internal warmth can transform swimming performance, and Xiphactinus appears to fit comfortably within that pattern of highly active marine hunters. Its behavior has often been compared with modern tarpon or barracuda, although the comparison quickly reaches its limits. Imagine those familiar predators enlarged until they approach the length of a small boat, then equipped with jaws capable of engulfing prey almost half their own size. Xiphactinus likely waited beneath schools of fish before launching sudden upward attacks, or accelerated through open water in rapid pursuits that ended with a single, decisive strike. The prey disappeared headfirst whenever possible, reducing resistance from fins and making swallowing easier. Evidence gathered from fossils shows that this strategy succeeded across a vast geographic range. Specimens have been recovered from deposits stretching across the former Western Interior Seaway, from Kansas northward into Canada, revealing that Xiphactinus flourished throughout much of this immense marine corridor. Its widespread distribution suggests not a rare specialist confined to isolated habitats, but one of the dominant hunters repeatedly encountering similar conditions across thousands of miles of warm inland water. The fossil record also preserves remarkable details of its diet. Stomach contents have revealed the remains of other large fish, marine birds, and smaller marine reptiles, confirming that Xiphactinus was an opportunistic predator willing to seize almost any suitably sized animal. These discoveries transform ancient feeding behavior from informed speculation into direct observation, preserving meals consumed tens of millions of years before human beings appeared. Some of the finest specimens reside today at the Sternberg Museum of Natural History in Hays, Kansas, where skeletons emerging from pale chalk still display the sleek proportions that once carried them through warm Cretaceous seas. They reveal an animal perfected for pursuit, one whose story extends beyond the graceful lines of its bones. In one extraordinary specimen, the final moments of predator and prey remain preserved together, unchanged across 80 million years of stone. A single slab of pale chalk carried a story that no witness could ever have observed, yet every detail remained waiting beneath layers of ancient stone. When paleontologist George Sternberg carefully excavated the remarkable specimen from the chalk beds of Kansas during 1952, he uncovered far more than the skeleton of a giant fish. Resting within its ribcage was another complete skeleton, preserved in astonishing detail as though the final moments of two lives had been folded together before time itself closed the page. The larger animal was a Xiphactinus, measuring about 14 feet in length. Curved neatly inside its body rested an entire Gylicus arcuatus, a swift predatory fish approximately 6 feet long. The smaller fish had entered headfirst, its fins tucked naturally along its body, exactly as a predator would swallow prey intended to slide smoothly into the stomach. Nothing had been scattered. Nothing had been crushed into fragments. Instead, predator and prey remained locked together in three-dimensional form, preserving an event that unfolded around 80 million years ago. Even by the standards of powerful marine hunters, this meal was extraordinary. The Gylicus approached nearly half the length of the Xiphactinus itself. Modern predatory fishes often consume surprisingly large prey, yet every attempt carries physical limits. A meal that is only slightly too large can become impossible to digest safely, placing tremendous stress upon the predator's body before digestion has even begun. The leading scientific interpretation suggests that Xiphactinus succeeded in swallowing its enormous catch, but failed to survive the effort. As the large prey entered the digestive tract, its rigid skeleton may have torn internal organs or damaged major blood vessels, leading to fatal internal hemorrhaging. Another possibility proposes that the prey became firmly lodged within the body cavity, preventing normal movement of food and causing catastrophic internal injury. Whatever the precise sequence, the outcome appears remarkably clear. The hunter captured its prize, consumed it completely, and then died before the meal could ever be digested. Both animals descended together through the warm waters of the ancient seaway until they reached the oxygen-depleted floor described earlier. There, the same unusual conditions that preserved countless marine creatures protected this extraordinary pairing as well. Scavengers were largely absent, decomposition slowed dramatically, and delicate sediments settled gently around the intertwined skeletons. Over immense spans of geological time, those sediments hardened into chalk, while the bones remained almost exactly where they had come to rest. Today, this remarkable fossil stands among the most celebrated treasures at the Sternberg Museum of Natural History in Hays, Kansas. Visitors do not simply encounter an impressive skeleton. They witness a complete ecological moment preserved without interruption, revealing predator, prey, behavior, and probable cause of death within a single specimen. Few fossils offer such direct evidence of how an extinct animal lived, hunted, and ultimately perished. As extraordinary as this discovery appears, it is not entirely unique. Paleontologists have recovered multiple Xiphactinus specimens containing unusually large prey inside their bodies. Again and again, the evidence points toward a hunter willing to attempt meals approaching the limits of what its anatomy could safely manage. These repeated discoveries suggest that such behavior formed a regular part of its hunting strategy rather than an isolated accident. That pattern offers a revealing glimpse into the ancient inland sea itself. Food was abundant, yet competition among large predators remained relentless enough that hesitation carried its own cost. A successful strike could sustain an animal for days, while a missed opportunity might quickly belong to another hunter moving through the same waters. Within that demanding world, Xiphactinus repeatedly gambled against its own physical limits, and on rare occasions, the stone beneath Kansas preserved the exact price of that ambition. Above even this formidable fish, however, swam predators for which Xiphactinus itself could become another meal. Among the swift shadows that crossed the inland sea, one hunter carried a reputation earned not through imagination, but through the marks it left behind on bone. Its scientific name was Cretoxyrhina mantelli, although paleontologists often call it the Ginsu shark, a nickname inspired by the famous kitchen knives whose razor-sharp blades became well known for effortless slicing. The comparison suited this ancient predator remarkably well, because its teeth were shaped to cut cleanly through flesh with astonishing efficiency rather than simply gripping, struggling prey. A fully grown Cretoxyrhina ranked among the largest sharks of its age, reaching lengths of roughly 25 to 26 feet and weighing close to 4 tons. Even many modern great white sharks would have appeared modest beside such an animal. Size alone, however, tells only part of its story. Every proportion of its body suggested movement. Like the living mako shark, it possessed a streamlined form, a narrow body, and a powerful crescent-shaped tail designed for sustained speed across open water instead of brief ambushes from concealment. Its mouth reflected the same purpose. Several rows of replacement teeth waited continuously behind the functional set, ensuring that damaged teeth could be replaced throughout life. The upper jaw carried about 34 teeth in each active row, while the lower held about 36. Altogether, as many as 7 rows remained ready beneath the gums. Each tooth presented a smooth, cutting edge, rather than the heavily serrated profile familiar from many modern sharks. When those jaws closed upon prey, they behaved more like a series of finely honed blades than crushing instruments, producing clean wounds capable of reaching deep into muscle and bone. Evidence preserved within fossils reveals just how broad its hunting habits became. Bite marks attributed to Cretoxyrhina have been identified on the remains of Xiphactinus, marine turtles, smaller sharks, plesiosaurs, mosasaurs, and numerous large fishes. These traces transform ancient feeding relationships from educated interpretation into direct physical evidence. Tooth-shaped grooves crossing fossil bones still match the size and form expected from this formidable shark, allowing paleontologists to reconstruct encounters that unfolded tens of millions of years before the first human observers. Some discoveries stand out even among this remarkable collection. Fossil teeth belonging to Cretoxyrhina have been recovered embedded within mosasaur bones, demonstrating that these sharks did not restrict themselves to smaller or weakened animals. Whether every encounter represented active predation or occasional scavenging cannot always be determined with certainty, yet, at least some injuries display patterns strongly consistent with direct attacks upon large marine reptiles capable of defending themselves with tremendous force. Another specimen preserves evidence of a bite inflicted upon a Pteranodon, one of the great flying reptiles that traveled above the seaway. Such a wound suggests that Cretoxyrhina sometimes struck animals resting upon the surface or floating after injury or death. The boundary between air and water briefly became part of its hunting ground, extending the shark's influence beyond creatures that spent their entire lives beneath the waves. Its earliest moments likely reflected strategies still observed among living members of the lamnid shark family. Cretoxyrhina almost certainly gave birth to fully developed young rather than laying eggs. During development inside the mother, the largest embryos probably practiced upage, consuming unfertilized eggs and sometimes smaller, developing siblings before birth. By the time they entered the sea, the surviving young already possessed the size and strength needed to begin life as capable predators. Yet even an animal so perfectly adapted could not endure every change. Around 73 million years ago, Cretoxyrhina disappeared from the fossil record long before the asteroid ended the age of dinosaurs. As the inland sea continued to evolve and ecological balance shifted, this magnificent shark gradually vanished. Its departure marked not the end of giant predators within those waters, but another turning point in a marine world where dominance never remained permanent. Most ancient sharks leave behind a strangely incomplete introduction to themselves. Their lives may have stretched across millions of years, yet after death, almost everything that defined their appearance disappeared. Long before stone could preserve the shape of powerful bodies, nature usually erased them, leaving only scattered teeth as the final record of predators that once dominated entire seas. Unlike most other large vertebrates, sharks are built primarily from cartilage rather than bone. Cartilage provides strength while remaining lighter and more flexible, an ideal material for swift swimmers crossing immense distances. It also carries a profound disadvantage for paleontology. Once a shark dies, cartilage begins to break down rapidly. Scavengers, bacteria, and ordinary chemical processes typically destroy the skeleton long before fossilization can begin. As a result, the overwhelming majority of fossil sharks are known almost entirely from isolated teeth, sometimes accompanied by a few mineralized vertebrae. That limited evidence presents an enduring challenge. Teeth reveal what an animal bit, but they rarely describe the complete body that carried them. Paleontologists can estimate overall size by comparing tooth proportions with living relatives, yet such calculations always involve careful interpretation. The exact outline of the body, the proportions of the fins, the placement of muscles, and many details of swimming mechanics often remain hidden beyond recovery because the original framework vanished before the rocks could preserve it. Within the Western Interior Seaway, however, uncommon conditions occasionally interrupted that familiar pattern. As earlier waters settled into oxygen, depleted depths and delicate sediments accumulated across the basin, certain shark carcasses reached the seafloor under circumstances unlike those found in most marine environments. Chemical processes within those sediments sometimes encouraged the cartilage itself to become mineralized before complete decay could occur. Instead of dissolving into the surrounding water, portions of the skeleton gradually transformed into stone, preserving anatomical details that almost never survive elsewhere. Some of the finest examples emerged from the Smoky Hill Chalk of Kansas. These extraordinary discoveries have often been described as shark mummies because they preserve far more than teeth alone. Several specimens retain complete sets of teeth still arranged within the jaws, long series of vertebrae extending through the body, protective dermal scales covering the skin, stomach contents resting where the final meal remained, and even mineralized outlines tracing the original form of the animal itself. Such preservation remains exceptionally uncommon among fossil sharks anywhere in the world. Those remarkable fossils transformed Cretoxyrhina from a shark known mainly through isolated teeth into one of the most thoroughly understood extinct sharks ever studied. Scientists could reconstruct the proportions of its body with far greater confidence than would normally be possible. The shape of the tail, the arrangement of the vertebral column, and the relationship between body depth and fin placement revealed how this predator generated speed through open water. Stomach contents provided direct evidence of diet instead of relying solely upon bite marks or comparisons with living species. Maximum body size also became far easier to estimate because complete skeletons replaced educated guesses based upon individual teeth. This depth of knowledge did not arise because Cretoxyrhina was necessarily more abundant than every other prehistoric shark. Rather, it reflects an extraordinary sequence of favorable circumstances. the body had to settle onto suitable sediment before extensive decay began. Oxygen levels needed to remain exceptionally low. Mineral-rich conditions had to encourage preservation instead of destruction. Fine chalk then covered the remains gently enough to protect delicate structures from disturbance while millions of years passed overhead. Every beautifully preserved specimen, therefore, represents far more than an ancient predator. It records an almost unimaginable alignment of geology, chemistry, and time. Without that rare combination, Cretoxyrhina might be remembered only through scattered teeth, another powerful hunter whose true appearance faded with the sea that once carried it. At first glance, the outline of Elasmosaurus platyrus seems almost as though it belongs to imagination rather than natural history. Its proportions challenge familiar expectations of how a large marine animal should be built. 4 broad flippers carried it through the inland sea. A compact torso held the strength needed for swimming, and a short tail trailed behind. Extending far beyond the body itself was an astonishing neck, so long that it appeared to belong to an entirely different creature, joined seamlessly to the rest. That remarkable neck contained 72 vertebrae, more than twice the total number found throughout the entire human spine, which contains 33. By itself, the neck stretched beyond 20 feet, while the complete animal measured roughly 46 feet from nose to tail. Despite those impressive dimensions, the head resting at the end of that extraordinary length remained surprisingly small. Instead of massive, crushing jaws, Elasmosaurus possessed a narrow snout lined with slender, interlocking teeth, ideally suited for gripping swift, slippery fish rather than tearing apart enormous prey. Such an unusual body plan has inspired generations of scientific debate. Carrying a neck of that length through open water would have created considerable resistance if swung rapidly from side to side during normal swimming. Modern interpretations instead suggest that the powerful body and flippers supplied most of the forward movement, while the neck served as a flexible feeding tool. Remaining below a school of fish, the reptile could have brought only its relatively small head toward unsuspecting prey, reducing the visual profile approaching from beneath before making a swift upward or sideways strike. Long before scientists understood those details, Elasmosaurus produced one of the most famous mistakes in the history of paleontology. During 1867, Dr. Theophilus Turner discovered the fossil near Fort Wallace in Kansas. Recognizing its importance, he sent the specimen to the celebrated paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope, whose enthusiasm for describing new prehistoric animals had already earned widespread attention within scientific circles. Cope worked rapidly to reconstruct the skeleton, but the animal before him possessed proportions unlike anything previously known. Its neck seemed so impossibly long that he concluded the elongated series of vertebrae must instead belong to the tail. Acting upon that assumption, he assembled the skeleton with the head attached to the wrong end of the body, creating a complete mirror image of the living animal. What appeared in print was not merely a small anatomical error, but an entirely reversed interpretation of one of the most distinctive marine reptiles ever discovered. The mistake did not remain unnoticed for long. Cope's scientific rival, Othniel Charles Marsh, examined the reconstruction and immediately recognized the error. Rather than correcting it privately, Marsh exposed the mistake before other scientists, bringing considerable embarrassment upon Cope. According to historical accounts, Cope attempted to recover and destroy copies of his original publication before they could spread further, yet the correction had already entered the scientific record. The incident deepened an already fierce personal rivalry that later became famous as the Bone Wars, a prolonged struggle between two ambitious paleontologists whose competition transformed the study of prehistoric life while often descending into bitter public conflict. Beyond that memorable chapter in scientific history, Elasmosaurus itself continued swimming through a far more demanding reality. Its immense length did not place it beyond danger. Fossil evidence reveals that Tylosaurus, one of the dominant marine reptiles inhabiting the seaway, consumed plesiosaurs as part of its diet. Remains of these long-necked reptiles have been recovered from the stomach contents of Tylosaurus specimens, demonstrating that even an animal approaching 46 feet in length could become prey within this crowded marine world. In the Western Interior Seaway, unusual anatomy offered remarkable opportunities for survival, yet no design, however extraordinary, guaranteed lasting safety. Power at the top of an ecosystem often reveals itself through what disappears beneath it. Every bite mark, every stomach fossil, and every interrupted life gradually points toward a single hunter whose reach extended across nearly every layer of the ancient sea. In the Western Interior Seaway, that role belonged to Tylosaurus proriger, a predator whose appetite united creatures from the open sky to the depths below. Although often grouped alongside the great reptiles of the age, mosasaurs belong to a very different branch of the evolutionary tree. They were neither fish, nor dinosaurs, nor plesiosaurs. Instead, they were highly specialized marine lizards, sharing a more recent common ancestry with modern Komodo dragons and snakes than with any other large reptiles inhabiting the seaway. Their distant ancestors had walked upon land, yet over surprisingly little geological time, their descendants transformed into fully aquatic hunters, with limbs reshaped into flippers and bodies refined for life beneath the waves. Among them all, Tylosaurus proriger became the largest predator the seaway ever produced during its greatest flourishing. Fully grown individuals reached between 40 and 45 feet in length and weighed several tons. The body stretched into a streamlined form powered by a muscular tail compressed from side to side, allowing powerful strokes that generated impressive acceleration through open water. Rather than relying upon prolonged pursuit alone, Tylosaurus combined strength, speed, and sudden bursts of momentum into a hunting style suited for almost any opportunity that appeared before it. Its most distinctive feature rested at the very front of the skull. Extending beyond the first teeth projected a blunt, toothless rostrum unlike that of any shark or crocodilian. Paleontologists have proposed that this reinforced structure functioned as a battering ram, striking prey with enough force to stun, disorient, or injure before the jaws closed. Such a blow could have transformed a dangerous struggle into a brief encounter, especially when directed against fast-moving animals capable of vigorous escape. The fossil record paints an unusually complete picture of its diet. Preserved stomach contents reveal fishes, sharks, smaller mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, diving birds, including Hesperornis, and flying reptiles that ventured too close to the surface. One remarkable specimen even preserves the remains of both a shark and a diving bird within the same stomach cavity, demonstrating that Tylosaurus accepted whatever profitable meal became available. Rather than specializing upon a single prey species, it occupied the highest level of the food web through remarkable flexibility, consuming animals that lived in very different ecological niches. Knowledge of this formidable lineage has continued to grow even in recent years. During 2026, paleontologists announced a newly described species named Tylosaurus rex, based upon fossils recovered from Texas. Estimated to reach approximately 43 feet in length This species possessed more robust jaws and distinctly serrated teeth, characteristics suggesting an even greater capacity for generating powerful bites. The discovery reminds us that the diversity of these giant marine reptiles remains incompletely understood, even after more than a century of careful study. Their evolutionary rise unfolded with striking speed. Mosasaurs first appeared in the fossil record around 95 million years ago. Within only a few million years, they spread through oceans across the world and displaced many earlier marine predators, becoming the dominant large hunters of the late Cretaceous. Such rapid success reflected an adaptable body plan capable of exploiting abundant prey wherever warm seas extended across the continents. Life, nevertheless, began with vulnerability. Juvenile mosasaurs remained small enough to attract attacks from large sharks, and many likely never reached maturity. Those fortunate enough to survive the hazards of early growth eventually crossed a threshold where few creatures posed a meaningful threat. Adult Tylosaurus occupied a position that scarcely any contemporary predator could challenge. Sustained by an inland sea productive enough to nourish immense hunters whose existence depended upon countless smaller lives woven together beneath them. The boundary between sea and sky offered no lasting refuge. Above the broad inland waters, another community of hunters traced wide circles upon rising columns of warm air, searching the shimmering surface for movement below. Fish that escaped the jaws of marine predators still faced danger from above, where wings rather than fins carried the next generation of skilled hunters across the horizon. The most familiar of these aerial reptiles was Pteranodon, an animal whose graceful outline has become one of the defining images of the late Cretaceous. Fully grown individuals achieved wingspans approaching 23 feet, allowing them to travel immense distances while expending surprisingly little energy. More than 1,100 specimens have been recovered, making Pteranodon the most abundantly represented pterosaur in the entire North American fossil record. Such extraordinary abundance has allowed paleontologists to examine differences in age, growth, and anatomy with unusual detail, creating one of the clearest portraits available for any flying reptile. Despite its familiar appearance, Pteranodon belonged to neither the dinosaurs nor the birds. It occupied an entirely separate evolutionary branch, although all three groups ultimately descended from ancient archosaur ancestors. Long before birds achieved worldwide success, pterosaurs became the first vertebrates known to evolve true powered flight. Their wings formed from skin and supporting tissues stretched along an enormously elongated fourth finger, producing a structure unlike anything found among living animals. One feature immediately distinguished Pteranodon from nearly every other flying reptile. Extending backward from the skull projected a long, bony crest whose shape varied between individuals. Scientists have proposed several possible functions for this remarkable structure. It may have served as a display used during courtship, allowed members of the same species to recognize one another across considerable distances, or contributed to stability while flying by acting as an aerodynamic control surface. The precise balance among those possibilities remains uncertain, yet the crest clearly represented far more than simple ornament. Life above the seaway demanded exceptional skill. Pteranodon likely spent long periods soaring upon thermals generated by warm air rising from the water, conserving strength while scanning below with keen eyesight. When suitable prey appeared near the surface, it could descend swiftly to seize fish with its elongated toothless beak, either skimming just beneath the waterline or making brief plunge dives before climbing once again into the air. In many respects, this feeding style resembles that of modern gannets or frigate birds, although Pteranodon achieved it through an entirely different evolutionary pathway separated by tens of millions of years. Even mastery of the skies offered no guarantee of survival. Fossil evidence preserves moments when the hunters above became prey for the predators beneath. Some Pteranodon bones bear unmistakable bite marks attributed to Cretoxyrhina, while one remarkable specimen contains a tooth from that formidable shark lodged between its vertebrae. Such discoveries suggest encounters near the surface where an attacking shark surged upward with enough force to strike an animal that normally lived beyond its reach. The open water became a meeting place where flight and swimming briefly overlapped in dangerous ways. Pteranodon did not travel those skies alone. Another pterosaur, Nyctosaurus, shared the same marine landscape while presenting an even stranger appearance. Although smaller in overall size, it carried an enormous crest rising high above the skull before dividing into long backward sweeping branches. The structure appears so dramatically oversized compared with the rest of the body that its purpose continues to inspire scientific discussion. Display, species recognition, and aerodynamic influence have all been suggested, yet no single explanation fully accounts for its extraordinary form. The chalk deposited beneath the ancient seaway preserves abundant remains of both flying reptiles, demonstrating that much of their lives unfolded above open water. Many ultimately fell into the sea, where the same unusual conditions that protected so many marine creatures also welcomed visitors from the air, folding their wings into the growing record of an ocean that reached far beyond its own surface. Feathers had already traveled a long evolutionary journey before the inland sea reached its greatest extent. For roughly 20 million years, birds had continued diversifying from their feathered ancestors, experimenting with different ways of surviving in changing landscapes and expanding coastlines. Above the Western Interior Seaway, some remained accomplished flyers, while others followed an entirely different path, surrendering the freedom of the air in exchange for mastery beneath the waves. Among the most remarkable was Hesperornis regalis, a bird whose appearance would seem strangely familiar and deeply unfamiliar at the same time. Measuring roughly 6 feet from the tip of its beak to the end of its body, it possessed a streamlined form built almost entirely for swimming. Its wings had dwindled into small vestigial stubs incapable of supporting flight, leaving no realistic possibility of taking to the air. Instead, dense bones reduced buoyancy, allowing the bird to descend efficiently through the water, while powerful hind legs and broad-lobed feet supplied the force needed to pursue agile prey below the surface. Its beak carried another feature that modern birds no longer possess. Lining grooves within the jaws rested rows of small, sharply pointed teeth that curved gently backward. Rather than crushing prey, these teeth acted like secure hooks, gripping slippery fish before they could twist free. In many respects, Hesperornis combined characteristics that today belong to entirely different groups of animals. It possessed feathers, laid eggs, and belonged among the birds, yet its toothed jaws preserved an ancient heritage that later avian lineages would eventually abandon. The overall result resembled a distant Cretaceous counterpart to the modern penguin, although no close relationship existed between them. Both evolved streamlined bodies suited for underwater pursuit, sacrificed flight as swimming efficiency improved, and became awkward travelers whenever forced onto land. Their similarities arose independently through comparable ecological pressures rather than shared ancestry, illustrating how evolution can repeatedly shape unrelated animals towards similar solutions when they occupy comparable environments. Most of each day likely unfolded within the warm upper waters of the seaway, where schools of fish and soft-bodied squid provided dependable food. Hesperornis probably dived again and again, using rapid strokes of its hind limbs to chase prey through the sunlit layers before returning briefly to breathe. Unlike flying seabirds that gather food with swift aerial movements, this hunter relied upon endurance underwater, where streamlined motion mattered far more than graceful flight above the waves. Those repeated dives unfolded within an ecosystem already occupied by formidable predators. The same waters that nourished Hesperornis also supported Xiphactinus, Cretoxyrhina, and the immense Tylosaurus. Fossilized stomach contents recovered from Tylosaurus confirm that diving birds formed part of its varied diet. A bird pursuing fish beneath the surface could itself become the next meal if an approaching reptile closed the distance before escape remained possible. Every descent, therefore, carried opportunities balanced against persistent danger. Not every bird surrendered the skies. A smaller relative known as Ichthyornis retained the ability to fly while preserving another ancient feature, a beak lined with teeth. Roughly resembling a modern gull in overall appearance, Ichthyornis hunted many of the same surface waters, but combined aerial mobility with swift feeding along the shoreline and open sea. Together, these birds demonstrate that toothed beaks and feathers coexisted across several successful lineages during the late Cretaceous, long before modern birds came to dominate the world's avian diversity. The rocks of the Western Interior Seaway preserve this remarkable evolutionary chapter with unusual clarity. Multiple hesperornithiform species occupied the same broad marine environment while differing in size, proportions, and diving adaptations, suggesting that each specialized upon slightly different resources. Rather than competing directly for identical prey, they divided the abundant ecosystem into overlapping niches, creating a layered community where birds explored many distinct solutions to life above, upon, and beneath the ancient sea. Some inhabitants of the Western Interior Seaway relied upon speed, others upon powerful jaws or keen eyesight. Archelon Iscaros followed a different strategy, one shaped through endurance rather than pursuit. Drifting through warm coastal waters with slow, deliberate strokes, it belonged to a lineage already ancient by the late Cretaceous, carrying a design refined across countless generations, even as the surrounding ecosystem filled with ever larger predators. Archelon remains the largest turtle known to have lived on Earth. From the tip of its beak to the end of its tail, the animal exceeded 13 feet in length. Its broad front flippers stretched more than 16 feet from tip to tip, forming immense underwater wings that propelled it across the inland sea with steady efficiency. Estimates suggest the largest individuals approached 4,900 pounds in weight, placing them among the truly gigantic reptiles inhabiting those waters. In overall size, the animal has often been compared with a Volkswagen Beetle, although its graceful movements bore little resemblance to any machine. Despite such impressive dimensions, its body differed in a fundamental way from the sea turtles familiar today. Instead of carrying a heavy, fully ossified dome, Archelon possessed a leathery carapace, supported internally by a framework of sturdy, bony struts. The result resembled a strong lattice beneath thick skin rather than a continuous shield of solid bone. Reducing the amount of dense skeletal material lowered overall weight while improving movement through the water, allowing the turtle to travel long distances with less effort than an equally large animal enclosed within a rigid shell. Its feeding habits reflected a similarly specialized design. The sharply hooked beak lacked teeth, but provided an effective tool for grasping soft-bodied prey. Jellyfish likely formed an important part of its diet, joined by squid and ammonites, drifting through the productive waters of the Seaway. Rather than chasing swift fishes through prolonged pursuit, Archelon probably gathered slower prey that required precision more than speed, occupying a distinct ecological role alongside the many active hunters already filling the marine food web. Even an animal of such extraordinary size lived under constant pressure from larger carnivores. The inland sea supported Tylosaurus, whose varied appetite extended across almost every major group of marine vertebrates. Fossil material housed at the University of Kansas includes the shell of a large sea turtle bearing more than 100 bite marks attributed to mosasaur teeth. Those wounds preserve the physical evidence of repeated attacks powerful enough to gouge deeply into the protective framework, demonstrating that the shell, however formidable, could not guarantee complete safety against the greatest marine reptiles. The fossil record preserves another extraordinary chapter in the life of this remarkable turtle. During 1895, a specimen discovered in South Dakota revealed that its right front flipper had been bitten away before death. Examination of the damaged bones showed unmistakable signs of healing, indicating that the animal survived the violent encounter and continued living despite the permanent loss of one of its primary swimming limbs. Only much later did it finally settle upon the seafloor, where unusual geological conditions preserve the evidence of both injury and recovery. Archelon fossils have since been recovered from Kansas, South Dakota, Wyoming, and Nebraska, landscapes that today lie hundreds of miles from any ocean yet once formed part of the ancient seaway. Each discovery reinforces the remarkable transformation of the North American continent across deep time while tracing the broad range of this immense marine turtle. Its greatest defense was never absolute protection, but resilience. Enormous size discouraged many attackers, while the thick, leathery carapace and underlying bony framework demanded tremendous force to penetrate. Survival depended upon enduring encounters that would have overwhelmed smaller animals. Within this vast inland sea, even one of Earth's largest turtles occupied a place earned through persistence, sharing an ancient world where every advantage remained subject to challenge. A shoreline can separate two neighboring beaches by only a few steps, yet water has often redrawn the history of entire continents. The Western Interior Seaway did far more than provide a home for extraordinary marine life. As it widened across the heart of North America, it became a barrier stretching for thousands of miles, redirecting the course of evolution on land just as profoundly as it transformed the waters that filled its basin. At its greatest extent, the inland sea divided North America into two distinct landmasses for roughly 30 million years. To the west lay Laramidia, a long, relatively narrow strip of land extending from what is now Alaska to Mexico. In overall shape, it resembled modern Central America far more than the broad continent familiar today. East of the Seaway stood Appalachia, an older and more geologically stable landmass covering much of what is now the eastern United States. Between them stretched an immense marine corridor that prevented most terrestrial animals from crossing from one side to the other. Isolation became one of the most powerful evolutionary forces of the late Cretaceous. Populations separated for millions of years gradually accumulated different adaptations, followed independent paths, and produced entirely distinct communities of dinosaurs. Laramidia eventually became home to famous animals, including Tyrannosaurus, Rex, Triceratops, Ankylosaurus, and numerous hadrosaurs whose fossils have been recovered in remarkable abundance. Their world unfolded upon a comparatively narrow ribbon of land, bordered by mountains to one side and the inland sea to the other, creating ecological pressures unlike those experienced elsewhere. Across the water, Appalachia developed along a separate trajectory. Although its fossil record is less complete because ancient rocks there were more frequently eroded or buried beneath younger sediments, discoveries continue to reveal an ecosystem populated by animals absent from the western landmass. Rather than representing a lesser version of Laramidia, Appalachia preserved its own evolutionary experiment, one shaped by prolonged geographic separation and environmental stability. The relative scarcity of fossils reflects the challenges of preservation rather than a lack of biological richness. By the late Cretaceous, the differences between these two dinosaur communities had become striking. The isolation endured long enough for their faunas to diverge to a degree comparable with the distinctions separating modern African elephants from Asian elephants. Both belong to closely related groups, yet each followed its own evolutionary history after long periods without regular contact. Dinosaurs on opposite sides of the seaway experienced a similar process, responding independently to changing climates, vegetation, competitors, and predators. Research has continued to strengthen that picture. A study conducted by scientists at Yale University identified an eastern tyrannosaur and a hadrosaur from Appalachia belonging to lineages distinct from their counterparts in Laramidia. Such discoveries demonstrate that even familiar groups evolved along separate branches once the inland sea interrupted regular movement across the continent. Every newly described fossil adds another piece to a landscape where parallel histories unfolded only a few hundred miles apart, divided not by mountains, but by water. The barrier was not absolutely permanent. At intervals, fluctuations in global sea level caused portions of the seaway to retreat, exposing temporary land bridges between east and west. These connections were brief in geological terms, allowing only limited opportunities for animals to disperse before rising waters restored the separation. Most populations, therefore, remained isolated for countless generations, preserving the distinct character of each continental ecosystem. The influence of the Western Interior Seaway reached far beyond the creatures swimming within its waters. It determined where dinosaur lineages could spread, where they remained confined, and which populations continued evolving apart until the closing chapters of the Cretaceous. Even after the sea itself vanished, the consequences of that ancient division endured. Part of the biological contrast between the western and eastern regions of modern North America traces its origin to this vanished inland sea, whose broad waters quietly guided the destiny of life across an entire continent. Far below the crowded waters where hunters pursued prey and wings crossed above the waves, another world unfolded according to entirely different rules. It was not defined by speed, struggle, or escape. Instead, the deepest parts of the Western Interior Seaway periodically became places where ordinary marine life could no longer survive. In those intervals, the seafloor transformed into one of the most extraordinary natural archives ever created, preserving moments that would otherwise have disappeared forever. By the height of the seaway's flourishing, life near the surface had become astonishingly abundant. Vast communities of microscopic organisms captured sunlight and multiplied across the warm waters. Fish, marine reptiles, sharks, birds, and countless invertebrates depended upon that productivity. Yet every thriving ecosystem also produces a constant downward drift of organic material. Tiny bodies, waste, fragments of plants, and the remains of larger animals gradually descended through the water column like an unending biological snowfall. When enough of that material accumulated below, microscopic decomposers began breaking it apart. Their work required oxygen dissolved in the surrounding water. During especially productive intervals, however, the supply could not keep pace with demand. Oxygen disappeared faster than natural circulation could replace it. Bottom waters first became hypoxic, supporting only the hardiest forms of life, before progressing into fully anoxic conditions where oxygen was effectively absent and ordinary marine animals could no longer breathe. The benthic environment changed completely. Instead of supporting communities of worms burrowing through sediment, crustaceans searching for food, or bottom-dwelling fishes patrolling the seafloor, enormous areas became nearly devoid of visible life. Fine chalk particles continued settling from above, building an almost continuous blanket across the basin, while the usual activity that churns and mixes marine sediments largely ceased. The absence of bottom-dwelling organisms left the sediment remarkably undisturbed, allowing delicate structures to remain exactly where they came to rest. Whenever an animal died higher in the water column, gravity slowly carried it downward into this unusual environment. Under more typical conditions, scavengers would have stripped away soft tissues, currents would have scattered bones, and burrowing animals would have broken apart the surrounding sediment. Here, those familiar processes were greatly reduced or entirely absent. Bodies settled gently into the soft chalk and gradually became covered by additional layers of sediment, sometimes within only weeks or months, before extensive disturbance could occur. That rare combination of circumstances explains why the Western Interior Seaway has yielded some of the finest marine fossils ever discovered. Paleontologists have uncovered sharks preserving every tooth in its original anatomical position rather than scattered individually after decay. Mosasaurs have emerged with vertebrae remaining in their natural sequence from skull to tail. Fossil fishes still retain the contents of their stomachs, revealing their final meals, while pterosaurs rest with fragile wing bones preserved together instead of dispersed across the ancient seabed. Each specimen captures not merely an isolated skeleton, but an instant from a vanished ecosystem, recorded with astonishing completeness. Such preservation has reshaped scientific understanding of animals already encountered throughout this journey. Flexible cartilage, delicate skin impressions, feeding behavior, growth, and even injuries sustained during life have all become visible because decomposition paused long enough for geology to take over. The chalk did more than entomb the dead. It protected countless biological details that would almost certainly have vanished under ordinary marine conditions. Paleontologist Laura Wilson described the Western Interior Seaway with a phrase both memorable and deeply fitting, calling it Hell's Aquarium. Near the sunlit surface, every layer of water supported predators, prey, competition, and constant movement. Far below, the deepest waters entered long intervals of profound stillness where almost nothing lived, yet where almost everything arriving from above could remain undisturbed, gradually becoming part of one of Earth's most remarkable fossil records. The ancient sea no longer covers the center of North America, yet its floor has never entirely disappeared. Time slowly lifted portions of those buried sediments toward the surface, while wind, rain, and changing rivers patiently carved them open again. What once rested beneath hundreds of feet of seawater now stands beneath open skies, allowing the former bottom of the Western Interior Seaway to be explored with every exposed cliff and weathered hillside. Across broad stretches of the continent, rocks deposited within that vanished sea emerge in an arc extending through Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, Wyoming, Colorado, Montana, Texas, Alabama, and northward into the Canadian prairies. Each exposure preserves a different chapter of the inland sea, reflecting changing coastlines, water depths, climates, and communities through millions of years. Together, they form one of the most extensive marine fossil records anywhere on Earth. Among these remarkable deposits, the Smoky Hill Chalk member of the Niobrara Formation in western Kansas has achieved particular scientific importance. For millions of years, natural erosion has steadily removed overlying layers, revealing fossils that once rested, undisturbed, beneath soft marine sediment. Entire skeletons, isolated bones, shells, and delicate impressions gradually emerge from pale cliffs as weather continues the work that geology began long ago. Many of the extraordinary animals described throughout this journey first reach scientific attention because those chalk exposures slowly surrendered their hidden contents. Some of the most striking landmarks created from these sediments rise unexpectedly above the surrounding plains. Monument rocks, also known as the chalk pyramids, stand as towering white formations reaching nearly 70 feet into the Kansas sky. Their walls consist almost entirely of compacted remains deposited within the ancient seaway, built from countless microscopic organisms whose shells accumulated grain by grain across immense spans of time. Standing before those towering outcrops today is, in effect, standing beside a cliff that once formed part of the ocean floor. The Niobrara chalk itself tells a story far richer than a single uninterrupted deposit. Different layers preserve distinct biological communities corresponding to changing intervals in the history of the seaway. Variations in fossil species, sediment composition, and chemical signatures reveal shifts in water depth, oxygen availability, climate, and marine productivity. Paleontologists read those stacked layers much as historians examine successive chapters within a carefully preserved manuscript, discovering how entire ecosystems change through time rather than viewing the ancient sea as a single frozen moment. Rex Buchanan, Director Emeritus of the Kansas Geological Survey, summarized the importance of these rocks with a memorable observation. He noted that in nearly any major museum displaying marine fossils from the late Cretaceous, the labels frequently lead back to Kansas. That reputation reflects generations of discoveries made possible by unusually complete preservation and exceptional exposures rather than simple chance alone. The Niobrara Formation is only one part of a much broader geological record. Another important deposit, the Pierre Shale, appears across large portions of the Great Plains and forms broad belts along the Front Range of Colorado, as well as extensive areas throughout the Dakotas. Together, these formations preserve complementary records of different environments within the ancient seaway, expanding scientific understanding far beyond any single locality. Even today, remarkable fossils continue emerging through entirely ordinary natural processes. After periods of heavy rain, erosion sometimes exposes shark teeth, ammonites, or mosasaur vertebrae within cultivated fields. Farmers working private land across former seaway regions occasionally encounter these ancient remains while tending crops, discovering pieces of an ocean that vanished tens of millions of years ago beneath familiar landscapes. The legacy of those sediments extends beyond paleontology. Organic materials settling onto the seafloor during the seaway's most productive intervals became deeply buried over immense spans of time, eventually contributing to valuable reserves of natural gas and oil. The same biological abundance that sustained an extraordinary marine ecosystem ultimately shaped both the scientific and geological wealth preserved within the ancient floor of the Western Interior Seaway. Long before museum galleries displayed towering skeletons beneath bright lights, the chalk hills of western Kansas drew a small number of determined naturalists carrying little more than field notebooks, simple excavation tools, and an extraordinary sense of curiosity. The pale cliffs had already spent millions of years releasing fragments of an ancient ocean into the open air. During the latter part of the 19th century, those discoveries became the center of one of the most famous rivalries in the history of science. The conflict became known as the Bone Wars, a prolonged contest between the paleontologists Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope. Both men possessed remarkable scientific ability, yet their relationship grew increasingly hostile as each sought to surpass the other through new discoveries, rapid publications, and expanding collections. Their competition accelerated the pace of paleontology across North America, although it also encouraged personal disputes, hurried interpretations, and lasting controversy. When attention turned toward the Kansas chalk during the 1870s, neither scientist fully anticipated what those ancient marine rocks would reveal. Until then, much of prehistoric North America had been imagined primarily as a landscape dominated by land-dwelling reptiles. The fossils emerging from the former seafloor painted an entirely different picture, introducing an astonishing community of giant marine reptiles, immense fishes, flying reptiles, ancient birds, and other creatures unlike anything then recognized from the continent. Edward Drinker Cope reached Kansas during 1871 and examined remarkable remains of Elasmosaurus recovered from the chalk deposits. As recalled earlier in this journey, his initial reconstruction famously placed the skull at the end of the tail rather than the neck, an error later recognized by Othniel Charles Marsh. The mistake became one of the defining episodes of their rivalry, yet the fossil itself remained a scientific treasure whose extraordinary anatomy permanently expanded understanding of marine reptiles. Marsh soon made discoveries equally transformative. His collecting teams recovered the first major specimens of Pteranodon from the Kansas chalk, demonstrating beyond doubt that large flying reptiles had once soared above North America. Their enormous wings and distinctive crests challenged earlier assumptions about prehistoric ecosystems, revealing that ancient skies supported animals every bit as remarkable as those inhabiting the land and sea below. The same deposits also yielded the first known specimens of Hesperornis, the flightless diving bird whose toothed jaws preserved an unexpected chapter in avian evolution. Here was unmistakable evidence that birds of the late Cretaceous still retained characteristics long vanished from their modern descendants. Fossils from the Seaway therefore illuminated not only extinct species, but also the broader evolutionary history, connecting ancient birds with those living today. Another name gradually became inseparable from the Kansas chalk. Charles Hazelius Sternberg, together with his sons, devoted decades to patiently exploring those fossil-rich outcrops. Their family recovered hundreds of remarkable specimens through careful fieldwork, preserving discoveries that might otherwise have weathered away. Among the most celebrated was the famous Xiphactinus, containing another fish preserved within its stomach, a fossil that captured an ordinary feeding event, interrupted and recorded across deep time with astonishing fidelity. As museum collections grew, scientists began recognizing that these discoveries represented more than an unusual assortment of marine animals. They collectively revealed the existence of a vast inland sea separating eastern and western North America for tens of millions of years. The continent had not remained an uninterrupted landscape populated solely by terrestrial dinosaurs. Instead, immense marine ecosystems flourished between isolated landmasses, shaping the evolution of both ocean life and the animals inhabiting distant shorelines. Public fascination expanded alongside scientific understanding. visitors encountering enormous mosasaurs, giant turtles, toothed birds, soaring pterosaurs, and predatory fishes gained their first vivid glimpse of a prehistoric world unlike any modern environment. The chalk beds of Kansas transformed ancient life from scattered fragments into complete ecological communities, allowing people to imagine an inland ocean whose inhabitants rivaled the greatest creatures alive today. Those weathered cliffs became more than fossil localities. They became one of the places where humanity first learned to see the vanished Western Interior Seaway as a living world reconstructed from stone. Every thriving ecosystem rests upon countless lives too small to notice with the unaided eye. The Western Interior Seaway followed that timeless pattern, building one of the most intricate marine communities in Earth's history, from organisms no larger than grains of dust. From those minute beginnings rose a living network that eventually supported predators stretching more than 45 feet in length, each layer depending upon the one beneath it in an unbroken chain. At the foundation lived coccolithophores, microscopic single-celled algae protected by delicate plates of calcium carbonate. Bathed in sunlight near the upper waters, they multiplied in astonishing numbers, converting light into energy that sustained the rest of the ecosystem. When individual cells died, their tiny plates drifted downward without pause. Across millions of years, those countless remains accumulated into the chalk deposits that still preserve the history of the ancient sea. Feeding upon this microscopic abundance came equally minute organisms. Zooplankton grazed among the floating algae, while foraminifera and radiolarians filtered or captured food suspended within the water. Though individually insignificant in size, together they formed an immense reserve of living nourishment. Their populations transformed invisible productivity into food accessible to larger animals, linking the microscopic world with creatures visible across open water. Above them flourished the ammonites, shelled cephalopods related to modern squid and nautiluses. Some measured barely an inch across, while others reached several feet in diameter. Their coiled shells drift through the fossil record in extraordinary variety, reflecting a group that occupied many ecological roles. Feeding upon smaller organisms, they in turn became an important source of nourishment for numerous predators higher within the food web. Their abundance helped distribute energy throughout the seaway, connecting tiny plankton with much larger hunters. Schools of bony fishes occupied the next great layer. Gillicus, Enchidus, and Similichthys darted through the water in search of invertebrates and smaller prey. Enchidus became especially distinctive because of the enlarged fangs projecting from its jaws, earning the familiar nickname of the saber-toothed herring, despite belonging to an entirely different lineage. Swimming together in large numbers, these fishes converted the rich supply of smaller animals into concentrated sources of energy for larger predators. Larger predatory fishes followed. Xiphactinus and Ichthyodex pursued the schooling species with speed and powerful jaws, dominating a level midway between the smallest prey and the greatest hunters. Their own lives remained vulnerable despite their impressive size. Sharks, including Cretoxyrhina and Squalocorax, hunted these large fishes while also feeding upon carrion and, at times, attacking marine reptiles. The boundaries between predator and prey shifted continually, depending upon age, opportunity, and circumstance. Marine reptiles occupied several interconnected levels rather than a single position. Long-necked Elasmosaurus searched for smaller prey with delicate precision, while Platecarpus and Dolichorhynchops exploited different hunting strategies and depths within the seaway. Resource partitioning allowed several reptilian groups to coexist without relying upon exactly the same food sources, reducing direct competition across this remarkably diverse ecosystem. Above them all swam Tylosaurus, whose broad diet embraced nearly every major inhabitant of the inland sea, including fishes, birds, turtles, plesiosaurs, and even other mosasaurs. Overhead, Pteranodon and Nyctosaurus patrolled the skies, while Hesperornis and Ichthyornis connected air and water through diving, soaring, and surface feeding. Great background grazers and drifting giants such as Archelon, Protostega, and the enormous clam Enoceremus occupied their own distinctive roles within this complex biological tapestry. Preserved together within the chalk formations of Kansas and neighboring regions, these countless interactions reveal not isolated species, but an entire functioning ecosystem. From microscopic algae to immense apex predators, few ancient environments offer such a complete and finely detailed record of how life was organized during the late Cretaceous, allowing the vanished Western Interior Seaway to be understood as one interconnected living world rather than a collection of separate fossils. Nothing in geology remains fixed forever. The forces that raise mountains, deepen basins, and redirect oceans often work together in ways that seem almost contradictory. The Western Interior Seaway existed because immense movements beneath Earth's surface created the conditions for its arrival, yet those very same movements were already preparing the landscape for its eventual disappearance. Its beginning and its ending emerged from a single, continuous geological process unfolding across millions of years. Beneath the ancient Pacific Ocean, the Farallon Plate continued its long descent beneath the North American Plate. Earlier in this journey, that slow convergence shaped the broad depression that welcomed advancing seawater into the continent's interior. The unusually shallow angle of subduction transferred compressional forces far inland, bending portions of the continent downward until a vast basin developed between regions of higher ground. Water merely occupied the space that tectonic forces had patiently created. Yet subduction never produced only one consequence. While the continental interior sagged, the same immense transfer of energy also compressed and thickened the crust farther west. Rocks that had rested deep below the surface gradually rose upward through the prolonged mountain-building episode known as the Laramide orogeny. The Rocky Mountains began taking shape during this interval, growing through repeated pulses of uplift that transformed the western edge of the continent into an increasingly rugged landscape. Those rising mountains immediately entered into partnership with erosion. Freshly elevated slopes faced rainfall, streams, seasonal flooding, and the relentless action of gravity. Every valley carried fragments of newly exposed rock downhill. Rivers gathered sand, silt, gravel, and clay before transporting them eastward toward the inland sea. Year after year, century after century, and eventually across millions of years, enormous quantities of sediment accumulated along the western margin of the seaway. River deltas expanded as fresh deposits spread across shallow marine environments. Layers of sediment gradually occupied space that had once belonged entirely to open water. The basin that tectonic forces had excavated so slowly now began filling from its western edge through entirely natural geological processes. Each grain, settling onto the seafloor, represented another tiny contribution toward reshaping the continent. At the same time, changes were occurring far beyond North America. Activity along the great mid-ocean ridges of the world gradually declined. As the production of new oceanic crust slowed, the average elevation of the ocean floor decreased over immense spans of time. That subtle adjustment increased the capacity of the world's ocean basins, allowing more water to be stored within them. Global sea levels consequently fell, not because oceans vanished, but because the shape of Earth's seafloor itself was changing. These separate geological events converged with remarkable precision. The Rocky Mountains continued rising along the western horizon. Rivers steadily delivered sediment into the basin. Worldwide sea levels slowly retreated. Together, they reduced the depth and extent of the Western Interior Seaway from multiple directions at once. Water withdrew from shorelines that had persisted for millions of years, while expanding coastal plains and growing deltas occupied territory once covered by waves. The retreat did not occur as one uninterrupted event. Shorelines advanced and retreated repeatedly as regional conditions fluctuated, creating temporary reversals before the overall trend resumed. Even so, the long-term direction had become unmistakable. The basin could no longer maintain the immense marine corridor that had divided the continent for so much of the late Cretaceous. Perhaps the most elegant aspect of this transformation lies in its symmetry. The Farallon Plate never changed its fundamental role. Throughout the history of the Seaway, it remained the driving force beneath both creation and decline. By bending the continent downward, it prepared a place for the inland sea. By raising mountains, feeding rivers with sediment, and participating in broader tectonic changes affecting global sea level, it also ensured that the basin would one day become land once again. The physical mechanisms responsible for the Seaway's disappearance had been present from the very beginning, patiently unfolding beside the processes that first allowed its waters to arrive. The Western Interior Seaway never remained the same sea from 1 million years to the next. Like a shoreline responding to a tide measured not in hours but across immense spans of geological time, its boundaries shifted again and again. Coastlines wandered across the continent. Waters deepened before becoming shallow once more, and habitats repeatedly appeared, disappeared, and returned. Rather than following a simple path from birth to extinction, the inland sea lived through a long sequence of expansions and contractions that continually reshaped the world within it. Throughout approximately 34 million years, changing sea levels and ongoing tectonic activity caused the seaway to fluctuate dramatically in both size and depth. Paleontologists and geologists recognize several major intervals of marine advance, known as transgressions, separated by periods of retreat called regressions. Each phase altered the geography of North America in subtle or dramatic ways, redrawing coastlines that no map could have captured for very long. These successive stages have become known by names reflecting distinctive chapters in the history of the same enduring body of water. The Maori Sea represents an earlier configuration, followed by the Greenhorn Sea, the Niobrara Sea, and later the Pierre Seaway. None existed as completely separate oceans. Instead, each describes a different arrangement of shorelines, water depths, sedimentation, and marine environments as conditions evolved through the late Cretaceous. During major regressions, seawater withdrew from broad, shallow regions, exposing landscapes that had rested beneath waves for thousands of generations. Mudflats stretched across newly uncovered ground. Coastal swamps developed where fresh water mixed with lingering seawater, and brackish lagoons formed behind shifting barriers of sediment. These environments persisted only as long as regional conditions allowed before advancing seas reclaimed them once again. The continent repeatedly exchanged land for water and water for land without any abrupt boundary separating one world from the next. Those recurring changes became permanently recorded within the rocks themselves. Chalk accumulated during intervals, favoring abundant microscopic marine life, while shale formed where finer sediments settled through calmer waters. Sandstone marked times when shorelines or river systems delivered coarser material into the basin. Stacked one above another, these contrasting layers created the stratigraphic sequence now visible across Kansas and neighboring regions. The cliffs exposed today preserve the rhythm of an inland sea repeatedly advancing and retreating, each layer representing another stage in an extraordinarily long geological cycle. Living communities responded to every shift. As northern connections strengthened during some intervals, marine organisms originating from Arctic waters expanded into the Seaway. At other times, stronger influence from the Gulf of Mexico introduced different species from the south. Populations met, mixed, competed, and adapted as environmental conditions changed. These repeated exchanges encouraged new evolutionary pathways while gradually altering the composition of entire ecosystems. The inland sea, present around 90 million years ago, therefore differed noticeably from the one existing roughly 75 million years later. Different invertebrates dominated portions of the seafloor. Fish communities changed as species appeared and disappeared. Marine reptiles rose or declined according to shifting habitats and available prey. Even apex predators were not permanent rulers. Cretoxyrhina, the formidable shark encountered earlier in this journey, vanished around 73 million years ago. Its disappearance likely influenced in part by the continuing contraction of deep water environments that had supported its hunting strategy for millions of years. Seen through this broader perspective, the fossil record preserves far more than a single ancient ecosystem. Each layer captures one interval within a continually changing marine landscape, recording different coastlines, different climates, and different communities linked by the enduring presence of the Western Interior Seaway. Together, those chapters reveal an ocean that breathed across geological time, expanding, retreating, and reshaping life with every slow pulse written into the rocks. The end of the Western Interior Seaway arrived with no single moment that could be marked upon a calendar. Its retreat unfolded gradually, almost imperceptibly across generations, beyond counting. Shorelines shifted a little farther each age, channels narrowed, broad expanses of open water became shallower, and landscapes that had rested beneath waves for millions of years slowly emerged beneath the sky. The transformation was steady enough that no creature living beside its shores could have witnessed the entire passage from inland sea to continent. By around 70 million years ago, the final regression had begun in earnest. Geological processes that had been gathering strength for millions of years now worked together with increasing effectiveness. The Rocky Mountains continued rising along the western margin of the continent, while rivers descending from those growing highlands transported immense quantities of sediment toward the remaining waters. Sand, silt, clay, and gravel accumulated across the basin, steadily replacing marine environments with expanding coastal plains and river systems. The basin itself also continued responding to tectonic forces beneath the continent. Areas that had once sagged beneath the weight of geological processes gradually experienced renewed uplift, even as fresh sediment buried older seafloor deposits from above. The remaining marine basin, therefore, became progressively shallower through two complementary mechanisms. Land rose from below while erosion supplied material from above, reducing the space available for the inland sea with every passing interval. At the same time, worldwide sea levels continued their long decline. As activity along the great mid-ocean ridges diminished and Earth's climate gradually cooled, the volume and distribution of ocean water changed across the globe. Depending upon the interval being examined, Geological evidence indicates cumulative sea level declines ranging from roughly 65 feet to well over 300 feet. Such changes unfolded over immense spans of time, yet they steadily reduced the ability of seawater to penetrate deep into the heart of North America. The retreat did not occur evenly across the entire seaway. One of the earliest major turning points came when shrinking waters across the region that would become the Dakotas divided the inland sea into separate northern and southern arms. Marine pathways that had once allowed unrestricted movement between distant populations became increasingly restricted. As the northern portion continued withdrawing, that connection disappeared entirely, leaving only the southern remnant linked with the Gulf of Mexico. Geologists refer to this concluding chapter as the Pierre Seaway. Compared with its earlier grandeur, it occupied a much narrower corridor extending across the continent. Coastlines migrated steadily southward, while rivers expanded over newly exposed ground. Habitats that had supported generations of marine reptiles, fishes, sharks, ammonites, and seabirds gradually yielded to floodplains, forests, and freshwater environments. The great inland ocean diminished without abrupt catastrophe, surrendering its territory mile by mile. Around 66 million years ago, the last extensive shallow waters finally disappeared. For the first time in approximately 34 million years, the central interior of North America stood once again as continuous land. The vast marine corridor that had separated eastern and western ecosystems no longer existed. Its absence permanently altered migration routes, drainage patterns, climates, and the geography inherited by every later age. Yet the seaway itself never truly vanished. Its floor remained exactly where it had always been, buried beneath younger sediments, compressed into chalk and shale, then gradually lifted toward the surface through continuing geological change. Wind, streams, frost, and rainfall have spent millions of years patiently wearing away those rocks, exposing pieces of the former seabed across the Great Plains. Much of that broad landscape is, in a very real sense, the ancient floor of the Western Interior Seaway, continuing its slow transformation under open skies. The Pierre Shale offers one of the clearest reminders of that enduring legacy. Deposited as dark marine mud across the bottom of the inland sea, it now appears in broad belts extending through South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, Nebraska, Kansas, and the Canadian prairies. In places reaching nearly 20 miles in width, these outcrops preserve sediments laid down beneath vanished waters, allowing the ancient seafloor to remain part of the living landscape rather than merely a memory preserved within stone. For millions upon millions of years, the center of North America had been occupied not by forests or grasslands, but by water. Across that broad marine divide, life followed separate paths without ever crossing the distance between them. Evolution continued independently on opposite shores, gradually shaping communities that belonged to the same continent, yet no longer shared the same biological story. When the last waters finally withdrew, those long separated histories converged upon a single landscape once again. Laramidia had spent roughly 30 million years developing along the western margin of the inland sea. Appalachia endured through the same span upon the eastern side, isolated by hundreds of miles of marine habitat that few terrestrial animals could traverse. Each landmass responded to its own climates, geography, predators, prey, and ecological opportunities. Over countless generations, natural selection produced distinct combinations of species that reflected their prolonged separation rather than their ancient common ancestry. As the Western Interior Seaway contracted into its final southern remnant and eventually disappeared, a continuous land bridge slowly emerged between these former island continents. Valleys, river systems, coastal plains, and low uplands replaced open water, providing routes that had not existed for tens of millions of years. The physical barrier dividing eastern and western North America dissolved through ordinary geological change, yet the biological consequences were anything but ordinary. Animals that had never encountered one another now entered neighboring territories. Herbivores discovered unfamiliar browsing competitors. Carnivores encountered prey that had evolved under entirely different patterns of predation. Smaller animals faced new hunters, while established predators found themselves sharing landscapes with rivals possessing different strengths, behaviors, and ecological strategies. Every successful adaptation developed during isolation suddenly existed within a far more complicated community. This reunification likely unfolded gradually rather than through one dramatic migration. Populations expanded generation by generation as suitable habitat opened before them. Some Western lineages almost certainly spread eastward into former Appalachian environments, while Eastern groups moved toward landscapes that had previously belonged only to Laramidia. Rivers, forests, floodplains, and coastal habitats became corridors through which genes, behaviors, parasites, and ecological relationships slowly crossed the continent. The encounter between these separate faunas nevertheless represented a profound ecological adjustment. Species that had occupied stable positions within familiar food webs suddenly competed for resources with animals following different evolutionary histories. Established balances shifted as territories overlapped and niches became contested. Some populations probably flourished under the new conditions, while others declined as unfamiliar competitors altered long-standing ecological relationships. Such changes rarely occur through conflict alone. They also emerge through subtle differences in feeding behavior, reproduction, habitat preference, and seasonal movement, gradually reshaping entire communities across succeeding generations. These biological transformations unfolded while North America was already experiencing sweeping environmental change. The retreat of the inland sea continued altering regional climates, drainage systems, and vegetation. Expanding land-connected habitats that had remained isolated while simultaneously eliminating coastal environments that had persisted for millions of years. Cooling global conditions introduced additional pressures, encouraging further shifts in plant communities and the animals depending upon them. The timing of this continental reunion carries particular significance. During the final few million years before the Great Extinction at the close of the Cretaceous, terrestrial ecosystems across North America were already adapting to changing geography and newly connected habitats. Ecological relationships remained dynamic rather than settled. Evolution had not paused after the disappearance of the inland sea. Instead, it accelerated into another period of adjustment as formerly isolated populations encountered one another across an uninterrupted continent. The draining of the Western Interior Seaway, therefore, accomplished far more than the removal of an ancient ocean. It brought together two evolutionary experiments that had proceeded in parallel for approximately 30 million years, allowing lineages shaped in separation to participate within shared ecosystems once again. Long before the asteroid altered life across the planet, the continent itself had already entered a new chapter, one defined by reunion, adaptation, and the gradual weaving together of worlds that had spent ages apart. By the close of the late Cretaceous, Two immense stories that had unfolded independently for millions of years were approaching the same moment. One was written by the slow movement of continents, the rise of mountains, and the retreat of an inland sea. The other traveled through space, unseen across the darkness between worlds. Their paths converged at almost precisely the same point in Earth's history, bringing an extraordinary chapter of North American life to its conclusion. Around 66 million years ago, an asteroid approximately 6 miles across struck the region now occupied by the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, along the margin of what remained connected to the Gulf of Mexico. The collision excavated an enormous crater and released an almost unimaginable quantity of energy, measured in billions of times the explosive force of the atomic bomb dropped upon Hiroshima. Within moments, shock waves raced across the continent, while molten rock and vaporized material were hurled high above the atmosphere before falling back toward Earth. The consequences spread far beyond the impact site. Vast wildfires ignited across many regions as incandescent debris returned through the atmosphere. Dust, ash, and sulfur-rich material entered the skies, reducing the sunlight reaching Earth's surface. Photosynthesis declined across land and sea as darkness and colder conditions persisted through an extended impact winter lasting for years. Food webs that depended upon abundant plant life and microscopic marine producers began unraveling from their foundations upward. These global events unfolded while the Western Interior Seaway had already entered its final chapter. The broad marine corridor that had once divided North America had dwindled into scattered remnants, its connection with the greater ocean becoming increasingly restricted through tectonic uplift, sediment accumulation, and falling sea levels. Geological evidence suggests that the combined effects of continuing drainage and environmental disruption associated with the impact accelerated the disappearance of the remaining shallow marine waters. An inland sea, already fading from the landscape, reached its final conclusion amid worldwide catastrophe. The timing transformed the fate of nearly every remarkable creature encountered throughout this journey. Tylosaurus disappeared. Xiphactinus vanished from the oceans it had dominated. Elasmosaurus no longer glided through coastal waters. Pteranodon ceased soaring above ancient shorelines. Hesperornis, despite surviving countless generations within the seaway, also disappeared. Archelon, whose immense body had crossed those warm waters for millions of years, likewise passed into extinction. Cretoxyrhina had already vanished somewhat earlier, as shrinking marine habitats altered its world, yet the great ecosystem it once inhabited now collapsed completely. Among the greatest losses were the ammonites. For approximately 34 million years, they had flourished throughout the Western Interior Seaway, leaving behind countless coiled shells within its sediments. Their ancestors had survived several earlier mass extinctions across Earth's long history, enduring environmental crises that eliminated many other lineages. This final catastrophe proved different. Every surviving branch disappeared, ending a lineage that had occupied the oceans for hundreds of millions of years without leaving modern descendants. Not every inhabitant shared that fate. Several groups endured the transition and eventually gave rise to familiar forms inhabiting the modern world. Ancient sharks, belonging to surviving lineages, continued evolving through the ages that followed. Certain bony fishes persisted despite the collapse of marine ecosystems. Sea turtles and crocodilians also survived, carrying their ancestry across the boundary into a transformed planet. Small feathered dinosaurs escaped extinction as well, eventually diversifying into the birds that now occupy nearly every environment on Earth. Viewed together, these events reveal that the asteroid did not strike a continent enjoying long-established stability. North America had already spent roughly 30 million years changing through mountain building, retreating seas, shifting climates, and the reunion of long-separated ecosystems. The impact arrived as those transformations were still unfolding. The disappearance of the Western Interior Seaway and the asteroid catastrophe therefore became intertwined endings, one shaped patiently by geology, the other delivered in an instant, together closing the Cretaceous in layers of stone, ash, and enduring memory. Across the broad interior of North America, there are places where an ordinary walk across a field can become a journey into vanished oceans. A fresh rain passes, the soil softens, and small fragments of deep time emerge at the surface. They rest among grasses, wheat, and scattered stones, carrying no sign of the immense world from which they came, except the shapes preserved within ancient, mineralized bone and shell. The sea itself has departed, yet its presence continues revealing itself one discovery at a time. The waters have long since withdrawn, their great reptiles, enormous fishes, drifting ammonites, and countless microscopic algae no longer inhabit the continent. Even so, the geological record created during those millions of years remains remarkably accessible. Rather than lying buried beneath miles of younger rock, much of the former seafloor has gradually risen into the open landscape, where weather and erosion continue uncovering evidence of the ancient ecosystem. Stretching from Texas northward into the Canadian prairies, the Great Plains preserve much of that exposed marine foundation. Beneath rolling farmland, grazing country, and open prairie lie sediments deposited when waves covered the center of the continent. Wind slowly removes loose material from hillsides. Seasonal streams carve fresh exposures into bluffs. Heavy rainfall washes away thin layers of soil, revealing fossils that have remained enclosed since the late Cretaceous. In western Kansas, such discoveries are woven into everyday life. Following substantial rains, farmers crossing their fields sometimes notice dark triangular objects standing out against lighter sediment. Many prove to be fossil shark teeth, including those belonging to Cretoxyrhina or the scavenging shark Squalocorax. Other days may reveal fragments of ammonite shells, isolated vertebrae from mosasaurs, or bones carried upward by erosion from layers that had rested undisturbed for tens of millions of years. What appears to be an ordinary agricultural landscape still releases traces of an ancient marine world with remarkable regularity. The Smoky Hill chalk continues participating in that gradual process of exposure. At Monument Rocks, towering chalk formations weather beneath rainfall, changing temperatures, and persistent winds. Grain by grain, the cliffs slowly surrender fossils enclosed within their pale layers. Specimens hidden since roughly 80 million years ago eventually reach daylight through nothing more dramatic than the patient work of natural erosion acting across immense spans of time. Many of those discoveries find lasting homes within museums dedicated to preserving the history of the Western Interior Seaway. The Sternberg Museum of Natural History in Hays, Kansas, houses one of the world's finest collections from this vanished ecosystem. Among its remarkable specimens rests the celebrated fish preserved inside the body of a larger predatory fish, accompanied by beautifully prepared mosasaurs, giant marine turtles, sharks, and many other inhabitants whose skeletons continue expanding scientific understanding of the inland sea. The University of Kansas Natural History Museum preserves equally striking reminders of that ancient environment. Visitors encounter an immense mosasaur skeleton, extending approximately 45 feet in length, displayed alongside the shell of a marine turtle, preserving more than 100 visible bite marks left by a powerful predator. Such specimens transform isolated fossil discoveries into complete ecological stories, revealing interactions that unfolded millions of years before human observers existed. Each field season brings fresh discoveries as professional paleontologists and dedicated amateur collectors continue searching the chalk, shale, and sandstone formations of the Great Plains. Newly recovered specimens refine scientific interpretations, clarify evolutionary relationships, and occasionally reveal entirely unexpected details about animals already thought familiar. In several Kansas counties, fossil shark teeth are common enough that children often discover them during ordinary outings, collecting them with the same natural curiosity others might reserve for colorful pebbles along a stream. The legacy of the Western Interior Seaway extends beneath the surface as well. Organic material accumulated across approximately 34 million years of marine life became buried, compressed, and transformed within formations such as the Pierre Shale and the Niobrara Formation. Today, those ancient deposits provide important sources of natural gas and oil across portions of the Great Plains, linking modern civilization with the enduring geological inheritance of an ocean that disappeared long ago, yet never truly left the continent behind. Most ancient lives disappear without leaving any physical trace. Flesh returns to the surrounding world, bones scatter beneath weather and scavengers, and the countless ordinary deaths that shape every ecosystem pass beyond recovery. Fossils are therefore remarkable, not because they are old, but because they exist at all. Each preserved skeleton represents an unlikely interruption in the normal cycle of decay, and the finest examples preserve details that seem almost impossible to imagine surviving across tens of millions of years. Paleontologists estimate that fewer than 1% of all species that have ever lived are represented in the fossil record. Even among those fortunate survivors, preservation is usually incomplete. Hard bones, teeth, and shells withstand time far better than skin, cartilage, muscles, or internal organs. Soft tissues normally disappear within days or weeks after death, leaving little opportunity for geological processes to record their existence. The chalk deposits of the Western Interior Seaway repeatedly interrupted that ordinary pattern. Earlier in this journey, the ancient seafloor revealed itself as an environment where oxygen was often absent and scavengers were scarce. Combined with rapid burial beneath fine sediments and favorable chemical conditions, those circumstances occasionally preserved anatomical features that almost never endure. Instead of recording only durable skeletons, portions of the Niobrara chalk captured fleeting structures that should have vanished long before fossilization could begin. Among the most extraordinary discoveries are the celebrated specimens of Cretoxyrhina, preserving far more than isolated teeth. In several examples, the cartilage supporting the skeleton underwent mineralization before it completely decayed. Paleontologists can examine the complete outline of the shark's body, the arrangement of its dermal scales, the total number of vertebrae, and even the contents of its stomach. Such fossils transformed scientific understanding of an animal once reconstructed almost entirely from detached teeth scattered through ancient sediments. Marine reptiles received equally remarkable treatment from these exceptional deposits. Several specimens of Tylosaurus and Platecarpus preserve impressions of the skin covering their bodies. Those impressions reveal small, non-overlapping scales arranged in patterns closely resembling the skin of modern monitor lizards. The evidence confirms that these great marine predators retained unmistakably reptilian outer coverings, despite spending their entire adult lives in the sea. The preserved texture provides information unavailable from bones alone, allowing researchers to reconstruct the appearance of living animals with much greater confidence. One particularly unusual mosasaur specimen extends preservation even farther into the interior of the body. Mineralization captured portions of the trachea together with branching bronchi, delicate respiratory structures that ordinarily disappear soon after death. Their survival offers a remarkably uncommon glimpse into the anatomy of an extinct marine reptile, preserving organs that almost never enter the fossil record under ordinary conditions. The famous fish preserved inside the body cavity of a larger predatory fish is no longer regarded as an isolated curiosity. Additional examples recovered from the chalk demonstrate that this pattern occurred repeatedly within the ecosystem. Large predators occasionally swallowed prey so rapidly that digestion never began before death intervened. These repeated discoveries reveal genuine ecological behavior rather than an improbable accident preserved only once. Even fossilized waste contributes to the growing picture of ancient life. Coprolites are relatively common within the Niobrara chalk and preserve fragments of bone, scales, shell, and other undigested material. Careful examination allows paleontologists to identify portions of ancient meals, reconstruct feeding habits, and trace relationships between predators and prey with remarkable precision. Information once carried through digestive systems has become another enduring archive of the vanished sea. The same exceptional conditions also preserved articulated pterosaurs whose delicate wing bones remained in their natural positions after settling upon the seafloor. Animals that spent their lives above the waves entered the geological record beside sharks, fishes, turtles, and marine reptiles below. Together, these fossils reveal that the chalk of the Western Interior Seaway preserved not merely isolated remains, but fleeting moments of anatomy and behavior that geology almost never permits to endure. Climate is often imagined as something descending from the sky, carried by clouds, winds, and sunlight. Yet the character of an atmosphere is also shaped from below. Oceans, lakes, forests, mountains, and plains each influence the air resting above them, exchanging heat and moisture in an endless conversation. During the late Cretaceous, no feature participated in that exchange more profoundly across central North America than the broad inland sea that occupied the heart of the continent. A shallow sea does not merely fill a depression in the landscape. Its waters absorb energy during warmer periods and release that stored warmth gradually as surrounding conditions change. Day after day, season after season, evaporation carries water into the atmosphere, supplying moisture that later returns as rain. Across millions of years, such processes become powerful architects of regional climate, shaping environments far beyond the shoreline itself. The Western Interior Seaway functioned as an immense reservoir of both heat and moisture. Warm surface waters continually transferred water vapor into the overlying atmosphere, where prevailing winds transported humid air across nearby landscapes. Instead of experiencing the pronounced dryness that characterizes much of the modern Great Plains, the interior of North America remained considerably warmer, more humid, and more moderate throughout the changing seasons. Climatic contrasts between summer and winter were softened by the enormous thermal influence of the inland sea. Many paleoclimatologists compare portions of this ancient environment more closely with the modern Gulf Coast than with present-day Kansas or Nebraska. Fossil plants, sedimentary evidence, and climate modeling all support the picture of landscapes receiving abundant moisture beneath generally warm conditions. Rivers flowed through forests rich in conifers, flowering plants, ferns, and cycads, while wetlands and floodplains occupied broad stretches along the shifting coastline. Such vegetation could flourish because the atmosphere repeatedly received moisture from the nearby sea rather than depending solely upon distant weather systems. The waters themselves were far from motionless. Computer simulations developed by Penn State geologist Rudy Slingerland and his colleagues reconstructed a broad counterclockwise circulation pattern extending through much of the seaway. Within that immense rotating system, somewhat cooler water tended to move southward along the eastern margin, while warmer water traveled northward beside the western shoreline. Rather than allowing temperature differences to remain isolated, these currents continually redistributed heat throughout the inland basin. Circulation accomplished more than moving warm and cool water from place to place. Ocean currents also transported dissolved nutrients supporting microscopic marine life, which in turn nourished the broader food web stretching from tiny plankton to immense predators. Productive waters existed across much of the seaway because circulation prevented nutrients from remaining confined to isolated regions. The movement of water therefore influenced both climate above the surface and biological richness below it. Conditions along the western shoreline benefited especially from this maritime influence. Laramidia supported vast populations of plant-eating dinosaurs, including immense horned and duck-billed species, whose survival depended upon abundant vegetation. Moderated temperatures and reliable moisture encouraged extensive plant growth across river valleys and coastal lowlands. Those thriving herbivore communities, in turn, sustained large carnivores, including Tyrannosaurus rex and its close relatives, whose existence ultimately depended upon the productivity maintained by the nearby sea. As the Western Interior Seaway gradually retreated, its influence over the atmosphere diminished with it. The expansive source of warmth and evaporating moisture steadily contracted before disappearing altogether. Seasonal contrasts became more pronounced across the continental interior. Rainfall patterns shifted. Temperatures varied more dramatically between warm and cold periods, and landscapes slowly entered climatic conditions unlike those that had prevailed for tens of millions of years. Over immense spans of geological time, those changing conditions contributed to the development of new soils, evolving vegetation, and increasingly continental climates across the heart of North America. The broad grasslands familiar today emerged only after many additional chapters of Earth's history, yet their distant origins can be traced in part to the disappearance of the inland sea. Its retreat reshaped more than geography alone. It altered the atmosphere above the continent, changing the environments inherited by every ecosystem that followed. The grandest geological monuments are not always raised by giants. Sometimes they are assembled by organisms so small that millions could rest upon the head of a pin. Beneath the broad plains that now stretch across the heart of North America lies one of the greatest examples of this quiet labor, although its architects were neither reptiles nor fishes, but microscopic algae whose lives lasted only days before becoming part of a story measured in millions of years. The immense Niobrara Chalk Formation, extending beneath large portions of the American interior, owes its existence to creatures invisible without magnification. Layer upon layer of pale rock accumulated not through volcanic eruptions or mountain building, but through the steady activity of single-celled marine algae known as coccolithophores. Across unimaginable spans of time, their remains produced one of the most extensive chalk deposits ever formed on Earth. Each coccolithophore surrounded itself with intricate plates, composed of calcium carbonate. These tiny structures, called coccoliths, measured only a few thousandths of a millimeter across, yet they displayed remarkable geometric precision. Individually, they seemed insignificant, but collectively, they transformed entire oceans. Every cell manufactured its protective covering, lived briefly within the sunlit surface waters, reproduced, and eventually became another microscopic contribution to the growing seafloor below. The warm upper waters of the Western Interior Seaway provided ideal conditions for extraordinary blooms. Bathed in abundant sunlight and supplied with dissolved nutrients circulating through the inland sea, coccolithophore populations expanded into astonishing abundance. Trillions upon trillions of individual cells floated near the surface at any given time, continuously drawing energy from sunlight while absorbing carbon dioxide from the surrounding water. Their brief existence formed the foundation upon which the entire marine ecosystem ultimately depended. Death marked the beginning of another equally important journey. As individual cells broke apart, their calcium carbonate plates separated and drifted downward through the water column. Countless coccoliths descended together in an uninterrupted shower of microscopic particles, settling across the seafloor with extraordinary patience. Earlier chapters revealed how the chemistry of the basin protected delicate remains from disturbance. Within that environment, these tiny mineral plates accumulated year after year, century after century, until the ocean floor became covered beneath immense blankets of pale sediment. Pressure slowly transformed loose deposits into solid rock. New layers buried older ones, compressing the coccoliths beneath increasing weight until they became the dense, fine-grained chalk that paleontologists carefully excavate today. In many locations, these deposits eventually reached thicknesses of several hundred feet. Every inch represented the accumulated remains of innumerable microscopic organisms whose combined labor exceeded anything accomplished by the largest animals inhabiting the ancient sea. The influence of these tiny algae extends even into the language of geology. The term Cretaceous derives from the Latin word creta, meaning chalk, reflecting the extraordinary prominence of these deposits around the world. The chalk beneath Kansas belongs to the same broad interval of Earth's history that produced the celebrated White Cliffs of Dover in England. Although separated by an ocean and an entire continent, both landscapes preserve evidence of the same period of elevated global sea levels, when coccolithophores flourished across vast marine environments. Their story did not end with the disappearance of the Western Interior Seaway. Coccolithophores continue thriving throughout today's oceans, forming immense seasonal blooms visible even from orbit. They still construct delicate calcium carbonate plates, still absorb carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, and still occupy the base of countless marine food webs. Every generation contributes another minute addition to sediments settling across the modern seafloor, beginning rocks that may one day preserve the history of our own age. The chalk beneath the wheat fields of Kansas therefore stands as more than a geological formation. It is the enduring work of one of the most successful groups of organisms ever to inhabit Earth. Invisible during life, almost weightless after death, coccolithophores transformed an ancient inland sea grain by grain, leaving behind a monument whose scale can only be appreciated across the vast perspective of geological time. The certainty of solid ground is among the deepest assumptions carried through everyday life. Roads, fields, forests, cities, and mountains appear fixed beneath every step, giving the impression that continents possess an enduring permanence beyond the reach of ordinary change. Geological history offers a gentler, broader perspective. Across spans of time, far exceeding human experience, even the firmest landscapes reveal themselves as temporary arrangements within a planet that has never ceased reshaping its own surface. The Western Interior Seaway dissolves the illusion with remarkable clarity. It reminds us that familiar places have occupied astonishingly different worlds without ever leaving their position upon the continent. The landscape changes while the location remains. Shorelines advance, mountains rise, oceans retreat, and entirely new environments inherit the same ground in succession, each lasting only for a chapter within Earth's much longer story. Consider the land beneath Dodge City, Kansas. Today it stands approximately 1,500 feet above sea level and nearly 1,000 miles from the nearest ocean. During the late Cretaceous, however, that same location rested beneath warm marine waters. In geological terms, roughly 80 million years is a surprisingly brief interval, representing less than 2% of Earth's age. A span that seems unimaginably distant within human history becomes only a recent moment when viewed across the lifetime of the planet. Even that ancient sea was not the first to occupy the region. Long before the Western Interior Seaway spread across central North America, earlier oceans had repeatedly advanced over the continent before withdrawing once more. Between those marine intervals, dry landscapes emerged, weathered, and disappeared again beneath returning water. The history preserved within sedimentary rocks records a continual alternation rather than a single transformation. Land became sea, sea became land, and the sequence repeated through many geological ages. The mountains bordering that vanished seaway tell a similar story. The Rocky Mountains appear timeless when viewed from modern valleys and plains, yet they are comparatively youthful features within Earth's history. Approximately 100 million years ago, they had not yet risen into their present form. The tectonic forces responsible for creating the Western Interior Seaway also contributed to the mountain building that eventually lifted the Rockies skyward while helping bring the inland sea toward its conclusion. Landscapes, often regarded as permanent anchors, emerged from the very processes that erased earlier worlds. Across the Great Plains, another lasting signature remains beneath every horizon. Their remarkable flatness is not simply an accident of erosion or chance geography. Uniform layers of sediment accumulated across the broad floor of the inland basin while the sea occupied the continent. After the waters retreated, millions of years of weathering gradually exposed those extensive deposits. The broad openness that now defines much of the American interior carries the subtle imprint of an ancient seafloor shaped beneath tranquil marine conditions long before grasses covered the landscape. None of these transformations belong exclusively to the distant past. Plate tectonics continues moving the continents today, although the motion proceeds at rates measured only in inches each year. Such movement escapes ordinary perception because human lifetimes are so brief, yet over millions of years those modest distances accumulate into profound geographical change. Oceans widen or contract, coastlines migrate, mountain ranges emerge, and basins slowly develop where none previously existed. Given sufficient time, North America itself will again become almost unrecognizable. New seas are expected to appear, while existing oceans change, shape, or disappear altogether. Regions now occupied by thriving cities may eventually lie beneath marine waters, while portions of today's seafloor could rise into future landscapes inhabited by entirely different communities of life. The Western Interior Seaway therefore belongs not only to the history of the continent, but also to its future, revealing that Earth remains engaged in the same patient process that shaped the world beneath our feet. A world does not disappear all at once. Its ending begins while many of its inhabitants are still living ordinary lives, following familiar migrations, feeding in familiar waters, and reproducing beneath skies that appear unchanged. Only in hindsight does the full boundary become visible. Looking backward through the rocks, the Western Interior Seaway is revealed not merely as an ancient ocean that drained away, but as an entire living system whose climate, geography, chemistry, and inhabitants all vanished together, leaving no complete equivalent behind. Every remarkable creature encountered throughout this journey belonged to that vanished world rather than simply occupying it. Tylosaurus left no descendants to inherit its place. Xiphactinus disappeared without producing a later lineage that carried its form into another age. Elasmosaurus ended with the closing chapters of its own history. Archelon, Cretoxyrhina, Pteranodon, and Hesperornis likewise reached conclusions that extended beyond the loss of individual species. Entire branches of life's history came to their natural limits, ending ways of living that had developed across tens of millions of years. Perhaps no disappearance illustrates that truth more deeply than the fate of the Ammonites. Long before the Western Interior Seaway spread across North America, their ancestors had already flourished within ancient oceans for more than 300 million years. They endured the devastating Permian extinction, survived the profound ecological upheavals marking the end of the Triassic, and persisted through countless environmental changes that reshaped marine ecosystems again and again. Their beautifully coiled shells accompanied Earth through successive worlds, only to disappear forever when the retreating inland sea and the asteroid catastrophe closed the final chapter of the Cretaceous. The significance of the Western Interior Seaway, therefore, reaches beyond a catalog of extinct animals. It represents an integrated world whose parts depended upon one another. Warm waters influenced atmospheric circulation. Ocean chemistry governed microscopic life. Tiny drifting algae nourished food webs reaching upward through fishes, reptiles, birds, and enormous predators. Continental geography directed ocean currents, while tectonic forces slowly reshaped coastlines and habitats. Evolution unfolded within those conditions, producing organisms perfectly suited to an environment that would eventually cease to exist. The survivors inherited a transformed planet rather than preserving the old one. Small mammals expanded into opportunities previously unavailable beneath the dominance of giant reptiles. Birds carried forward the legacy of feathered dinosaurs. Certain sharks, bony fishes, crocodilians, and turtles continued evolving into later ages. Their persistence was not evidence of greater perfection or superiority. Survival depended upon circumstances that favored flexibility, resilience, fortunate geography, and ecological opportunity during a period of extraordinary environmental disruption. The giants of the inland sea had become exquisitely adapted to a world that no longer remained. That perspective lends unexpected depth to the modern landscape of central North America. Kansas is now known for expansive fields, broad horizons, and productive farmland stretching across level ground. Yet beneath those wheat fields lies the former floor of one of the most formidable marine ecosystems Earth has ever supported. The same ground once belonged to an ocean where a mosasaur, approaching 45 feet in length, pursued prey that included sharks, while immense fishes and ancient reptiles shared waters alive with dangers almost beyond modern comparison. Holding both realities together requires a shift in perspective. A familiar agricultural landscape and an inland sea of extraordinary predators occupy the same place, separated only by time. Neither version of the continent is more permanent than the other. Each belongs to a particular chapter within Earth's continuing history. The Western Interior Seaway invites a broader understanding of extinction itself. When a world ends, it carries away far more than individual species. It takes with it relationships, climates, behaviors, migrations, evolutionary possibilities, and countless ordinary moments that will never be repeated. What remains is not emptiness, but a remarkable geological memory, preserved patiently within stone, waiting for later generations to discover that another Earth once existed beneath their feet. Absence can leave a landscape just as completely as presence once shaped it. An inland sea may vanish, its shorelines erased, its waves forgotten by every living witness, yet the marks of its passage remain woven into the land with remarkable persistence. The Western Interior Seaway has been gone for approximately 66 million years. Its waters withdrew, its climates shifted, its great reptiles disappeared, and the continent settled into a new chapter. Even so, the ancient sea has never entirely departed. Across western Kansas, pale chalk continues emerging from hillsides and bluffs, where wind and rain patiently uncover another layer of the distant past. The rock remains fine-grained, soft enough to yield fossils that waded through immense spans of time before returning to daylight. A single shark tooth may weather from the ground after centuries of gradual erosion. Nearby, a mosasaur vertebra rests within the hillside until another season loosens it from the surrounding stone. Elsewhere, the graceful spiral of an ammonite slowly appears along a cliff face after thousands of years of changing weather, revealing an animal whose shell has outlasted continents, mountains, and oceans. The inheritance of the seaway extends far below the surface as well. Beneath portions of the Great Plains, deposits of petroleum and natural gas preserve energy originally captured by ancient marine life. Long before those resources warmed homes or powered vehicles across the American Midwest, they existed as microscopic organisms, drifting plankton, and countless other forms of life sustained within the inland sea, buried beneath accumulating sediments, transformed by pressure and heat across millions of years. That living world gradually became another enduring legacy hidden beneath the plains. Even the appearance of the modern landscape reflects those ancient origins. The remarkable openness of the Great Plains, the fertile soils supporting broad agricultural regions, and the distinctive chalk geology of western Kansas all owe part of their existence to conditions established beneath the waters of the Western Interior Seaway. Every harvest gathered from those fields depends, in some measure, upon landscapes shaped through geological events unfolding long before the first flowering grasses spread across the continent. Life itself still carries echoes of that vanished ocean. Throughout every modern sea, coccolithophores continue blooming beneath sunlight, surrounding themselves with delicate plates of calcium carbonate, exactly as their ancestors once did in the waters covering central North America. Their countless generations still support marine food webs while contributing microscopic particles that settle upon the seafloor. Grain by grain, they continue building rocks that belong not to the past but to Earth's future, extending a biological tradition that has endured across hundreds of millions of years. Within the Sternberg Museum in Hays, Kansas, another connection remains carefully preserved. The celebrated specimen of Xiphactinus still contains the smaller fish locked within its ribcage, preserving a final meal interrupted approximately 80 million years ago, measuring about 14 feet in length. With prey roughly 6 feet long still enclosed inside its body, the fossil captures an instant that would ordinarily have disappeared forever. Instead, it became one of the most extraordinary records of ancient behavior ever discovered. The Western Interior Seaway no longer occupies the center of North America, yet its presence continues through stone, fossils, living organisms, and the landscapes inherited by later ages. Its waters have long since vanished beyond recovery, but their history remains inscribed beneath fields, within museum collections, and inside the chemistry of rocks formed by innumerable microscopic lives. The inland sea does not require waves to endure. It survives wherever chalk preserves its memory, wherever fossils emerge from weathered hillsides, and wherever the patient record of Earth reminds us that worlds may disappear, while their stories continue beneath every step we take.